In 30 seconds, you will be witness to one of the greatest online events in the history of, well, online events. Descript proudly brings to you a topic that you deeply care about and whose name is the title of this online event. I'm Don. I am not your host. I am an overdub stock voice included for free with Descript. So, now, let's meet someone who actually works here.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. My name is Chris Zaldua. I handle all things content related at Descript, and I'm usually the one running the show behind the scenes while Jay hosts, but we're switching things up, and I'm your host today. If you're just joining us for the very first time, Descript is a collaborative media editor that allows you to edit audio and video just by editing text. Now, because Descript is built around transcripts of media, not just the media itself, it enables you to search and organize audio and video in powerful ways that just aren't possible in any other media editor. And we're going to cover how some of that works in our discussion today. Now, I'd love to introduce our special guest, James Shield, senior audio producer at the Times of London, joining us all the way across the pond in London. James, how are you?
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to meet the person who actually works here, as the intro says, and hello from slightly gloomy South London.
Yep, that's great. There you go. I'm just gonna go over some of the things that you're gonna learn today on this stream. First, we're gonna chat about using archive material in podcasts. We're gonna show you how Stories of Our Times uses archive material like news reports, snippets of other media to add context to their podcast and how you might do the same. Next, we're going to chat through searching and sorting media with Descript. James has built what he calls a searchable news firehose to rapidly import media into Descript and search through it on the fly. We're going to show you how that works. And lastly, we're going to chat through editing a daily podcast, and we're going to learn about some of the tips, workflows, and editing decisions that go into that process. Now, before we dive in, I have a question for our viewers on the stream. Do you keep track of your own podcast or video archive material, the work you've already done, you've already published? And if you do, how do you track it? And if you don't, would you like to? Share your thoughts in the chat with us as we go along, and we can chat through them. James, I think let's get started. Why don't we start by chatting about Stories of Our Times? And I know it's a narrative news podcast. Why don't you tell us what that means exactly and how that makes it different from other podcasts?
Well, a few years ago, the New York Times really hit on something quite special that newspapers can do, which is to take the stories that are in the paper, but to do audio storytelling with them, which is both making better use, I think, often of the stories that they would have in the paper. You know, they've already done the work to produce these things, and then also make the most of the medium of podcasts, which is, you know, podcasts can do an awful lot of things. They can do discussions like we're having right now, but one of the best things you can do is to transport people to places, introduce them to characters, tell stories that have stakes and twists and turns. And so really it's the innovation from other papers that we're building upon. But the New York Times was not the first newspaper to do this, to do narrative news. They were the first to do it in a daily fashion. But I remember 5 or 6 years ago, The Guardian did a podcast about their Keep It in the Ground campaign on fossil fuels. And that transported you inside the newspaper to see the kind of all the decisions that they were grappling with editorially. and introduce you to people on the paper as characters. So I think for a while newspapers have been trying to figure this out, and the Times and the Sunday Times is one of those papers. We launched last year, either at a fantastic time or a terrible time to launch a new podcast. So our first episode was on the 16th of March, 2020, which meant we had an awful lot to talk about. And so those periods when we were in piloting and kind of looking at the paper and saying, oh, it's a little bit of a slow news day today, very quickly disappeared as we got closer and closer to launch. But I think what we're trying to do every day is to take one big story, tell it in depth, and at the same time as telling the story, I think we're often trying to introduce people to our journalists and to journalism so that people can see what this job looks like, the amount of work it involves, to the extent that journalism has been under attack or that trust has decreased in journalism, we're trying to take that on as well.
So it's an interesting way of bringing listeners behind the scenes and also kind of showing them what goes on to make all this work happen.
Yeah, and I think of cases where we've, very often what you see in a newspaper is the final product of occasionally it's months of work if it's investigative reporting. So what we'll try and do is show, this is what it sounds like when a journalist is trying to get an answer from somebody, or when they're walking the streets trying to meet people who may have witnessed a crime. And, we've done all those sorts of things to introduce people to them as characters, and even just to, in Monday's episodes, which I produced, it was all about these kind of fantastic science stories, to hear the journalists interact with the scientists and hear them, how they do their own interviews for the paper. So we're always trying to do a blend of really good storytelling, but take you behind the scenes a bit as well.
That's great. That's great. Now, we've chatted a bit already about the concept of archive from a journalistic context. What does that term mean exactly, and why is it important for you and your work?
I think it can mean a couple of things. And I don't know if maybe it means something different in British radio than perhaps it does in US public media, but there's a very long-running program on Radio 4, which is the big speech radio station here in the UK, called Archive on 4. And what that program always does every week is dives into the BBC's archives, all the way back to the founding of the BBC, and tells an interesting story with it. So occasionally the archive can mean you're doing a program driven by, you've got amazing access to some tapes that people won't have heard, or they're not familiar with, or they haven't heard in a long time. In a more day-to-day way for us, what it means is bringing in the sound of the world outside. So we do interviews, and then we gather what we call actuality, which is a fancy way of saying, before the pandemic, you would go out into the world and record things, and then remember that.
Yeah,
and then with archive, we're trying to bring in, well, this is what the world is talking about today, and you may have heard this in the news and not quite made sense of it, or and occasionally with archive, you can go even further, and I guess we can look at a couple of examples where you have these huge collections of audio, and there's a story in there that you want to kind of fashion out of it. It's a bit like sculpture, you're trying to chip away everything that's not the sculpture in the end. And you end up doing that in our case, with Descript. And we started I started experimenting with Descript in October 2019 and thought this is sort of an interesting tech demo. And then it wasn't until, when was this? It was sort of early 2020. We thought, well, we should try using this for what we're doing, thinking, well, it'll be good to know how it works, but of course it won't be ready yet because it's pretty new.
Right.
And then we made a decision, I think in February 2020, that this is what we were going to do, with the prospect of working from home as well looming, and thinking, how are we going to collaborate and share our projects? And I think we got on the phone with Descript and said, can you guarantee it'll be fine? To the best of your abilities, because we're new, and so we've made every episode in it now for a year and 3 weeks.
That's fantastic. That's awesome. Prior to using Descript, what tools or strategies did you use to manage this kind of journalistic archive and just sort of add in this context to your podcasts?
Well, if you were to work on something like Archive on 4 or a big TV documentary or something, what you would often do is try and fish out everything that existed. Then your first step is to get it transcribed, which, not too long ago would have meant transcribing by hand. And then finding a way to somehow make that searchable, making notes as to where certain keywords were. But more often for the sort of thing that we would do, you're really relying on your memory of what if I'm doing an episode about the UK government's handling of COVID, I have in my head what those big moments were, and we'll talk and say, oh, it was when Boris Johnson made this particular speech, that was a key moment, or this was a key moment in Parliament. And then you would go and find it, and you would try and get it from whether it's YouTube or an official source, and you would sort of end up with these very short snippets as you were building a montage. So you'd be working on something, grabbing it, putting it in order, and that's how you would build what you were making. And in the very early days of piloting this show, we would have all of our interviews transcribed, and we'd have a kind of separate transcript. And then you might have a transcript for the clips that you wanted to use, and then separately we were working in Reaper to cut the audio, so you'd have to compare. Right, so I want minute 12 in the transcript, and then cross-reference it. And so that's what we were doing before. But it was quite an arduous, if you really wanted to get into the archives beyond just, I remember this speech, I remember this moment.
Right.
Slightly difficult to fish it out. I mean, with official sources, certainly episodes that we've done about American politics, C-SPAN is an amazing source, and you can search for certain keywords and find moments in speeches.
Right.
But the British Parliament website, not quite as fancy.
Right. Right. Do you know if other podcasts in other formats use archive in a similar way to this kind of narrative news style? Is it possible for other kind of podcasts, maybe interview driven, to rely on this kind of archive?
Yeah, you could do an interview show where if you're interviewing a politician, you might want to play them something they said in the past. That's quite common in interview shows. Or you may want to play them something that somebody else has said about them, that the opposition might have said about them. You could use it in all sorts of interview formats to do that sense of bringing the world in. So occasionally, I worked on a show a few years ago about economics that was not a narrative documentary, but it was more of a sort of discussion show. And we would always have a couple of montages in there. Because again, we wanted that feeling of, especially with economics, it was a show for ordinary people who are not economists. And that sense of, well, I've heard people talk about quantitative easing. What the hell is that?
Right.
And to bring it in. So I've always thought it's a useful way to make it feel as though you're talking about the things that are happening.
Right. Okay. So it's a good strategy for just establishing context, like laying down foundations, making sure listeners know exactly what it is that you're talking about, that you're discussing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you find yourself using archive material from your own work, from previous podcasts, or is it mainly reporting and news?
We do that occasionally. There was an episode we made in, I think, November or December, whenever the first successful vaccines were confirmed. And we went back to an interview. In fact, the last interview I ever recorded in a studio was, this is March the 14th, 2020, was with a person who works in developing vaccines at Imperial College in London. And I remember he came into the lobby and we did that sort of elbow bump thing that we thought was the right thing to do.
Yep.
And so we went back, and he was telling us at that point, all of this was new. The UK hadn't gone into lockdown at this point, let alone thinking about the exit strategy. And we were saying, right, vaccines, how does this work? And he said, well, it's normally 10 years. We're going to try and do it in 2, but that's what normally happens. And so when the vaccine was finally produced, we went back to that interview and used moments from there. More frequently, what I'll do is, making montages can be a very time-consuming thing to do, especially if it's something that hasn't just been in the news, and you're thinking, God, where am I going to find news clips from 6 months ago? Sometimes I'll go back and kind of raid my old episodes for montages that I've built before. In fact, I did that on Monday. and so that can be very useful. So yeah, we sometimes do revisit episodes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, you've briefly discussed this, but what are some of the sources that you rely on for this kind of archive material and this context?
Well, for my sins, use Twitter too much, and so I use the bookmarking function in Twitter all the time because you often see that's Twitter is a very good way of filtering sometimes the most notable
Yeah.
moments in in news and politics, and so I'll use that for bookmarking. YouTube also is a great source. As I've said, there's kind of particular sources for American politics.
Hmm.
From Congress or from the UK Parliament. I always think it's interesting to try and push beyond that because I know that's what other people do as well. So if if we've got the time, if someone that we're talking about might be a big public figure, if they've recently done a podcast interview or they did a podcast interview 5 years ago, I'll download that and have a scan through and just see, oh, is there an interesting thing they said in the past? So occasionally podcasts are useful. We've used clips very judiciously from normally movie trailers rather than movies, because the rights can be tricky. We just did
Right.
something about a team at NASA who are working on an asteroid deflection system, which they're going to test this autumn. And the poor guy who's the planetary defense officer is always asked, are you Bruce Willis? Is this like Armageddon? And so we're able to use a section from the trailer of,
Okay.
the differences in Armageddon. They have 6 days notice or whatever it is, and this guy is trying to spot these things a little bit earlier so that
Right.
we don't need to send the nukes. But
Right.
no, all sorts of sources.
Right. Okay. That's great. That's great. So let's talk about how you use Descript to organize all this information, all this archive. You built something that you call the Searchable News Firehose, which is a phrase that is just burned into my head that I have not been able to forget. Could you tell us what that is and just give us a brief overview of how it works?
Yeah, so it was November last year, and it was election night, U.S. presidential election night, and we made the episode for the following morning in the UK overnight. And what we really wanted to have was this sense of you wake up that morning, you reach for your phone, you press play on the podcast, and we tell you what's just happened, because you're probably going to wake up with that sense of what happened, beyond the results, because the chances were the result was not going to be very clear by that time. So I call it the Searchable News Firehose because I just wanted that sense of things are going to happen very quickly that we want to have access to. And rather than having to go and wait for certain clips to be picked and put on Twitter or put on YouTube and then to grab them, and very often that's only going to be the kind of big moments, certain speeches. I wanted more of a sense of the night, down to I want to give the listeners a sense of this is what the pundits are saying on Fox News or CBS, and I want that sense of here's what's going on. So what we made was a system whereby the audio from 3 of the big US networks plus our own radio station, we run a radio station called Times Radio, would all be something that we could search in Descript across the 6-7 hours that we were building that episode. And so that was the principle, so that we could, and it's something that if you work in the BBC, you have access to something called the auto rot, which I don't know what that stands for, but it gives you this sort of amazing access to everything that's been broadcast on the BBC and on other stations. But if you don't work there, you don't have that. And even if you did,
Right.
you wouldn't be able to kind of keyword search it for particular moments. So that was the initial plan, to see could we make something that would allow us to instantly search. And so I can show you some examples.
That'd be great.
If I can find it somewhere. But it allowed us so for us around I'm trying to think what time it would have been. Probably sort of 3-4 in the morning. There was that sense of if you remember from election night, of uncertainty
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
thinking we don't quite know. It's not a landslide for anybody, but it's kind of too early to tell. I don't know if I have this here. Let me search for it. We wanted to give our listeners a sense of uncertainty, and so we could search for. We were able to search hours and hours of content for keywords like Florida. Florida was a major issue. We were also, thankfully, it didn't happen that night, but we were worried there might be instances of violence.
Right.
And so we were able to search for,
I think you might
violent
be
crowds and that sort of thing.
in a different Descript window than the
I
one
think
that
I might be.
you're.
I'm just trying to get this up
Gotcha.
without
Yep.
also showing stuff that's secret
Yes,
in a
indeed.
different
That is
window.
important.
But not that it's terribly secret, but future episodes.
Of course.
Let me see if I can get it up. Okay, I'll allow this to load in the background. I mean, in the meantime, I can also show you a different example I've got here.
Yeah.
Which is, so that's literally what I mean in terms of it's a kind of news fire hose, which is we've got all the news coming in. We want some way to make sense of it, and in a way, we're performing that service for our listeners because they're trying to make sense of it too.
Right. Right.
Another way to work with this as well is when there's just a vast source of information. It's very unlikely that anyone will have listened to any of it. I mean, someone may well do this every day, but here in the UK, ever since last March, the UK government runs briefings, often with the chief medical officer, chief scientist, sometimes the prime minister. It's always a government minister. And we wanted a way to be able to search all of that. And so this is a much larger project, actually, because on election night, that was 5-6 hours of stuff across 4 networks. This is hundreds of hours of content going back to more than a year ago. And so we started to put every single government press conferences about coronavirus into Descript.
Okay.
And that's what this project is here. And so it took a little bit of time to organize. As you can see, we put things in folders, we put dates on it. And so I can see, right, on the 25th of March, we had Whitty and Vallent are the names of the 2 scientific advisors.
So you're using Descript not just as a tool for editing audio, but also as this way of organizing audio and information and being able to search through it. You're essentially building your own index.
Yeah, and the principle is, in the past, before this was possible, well, this was just impossible, really, unless you hired a whole team of people to do this. And so your starting point would be, I know that clip exists, let's see if I can find it.
Right.
And that's how we used this for an awfully long time. Just a faster way to make what we were building anyway. And this is a case of thinking, I think there will be stories in there, and I don't know what they are yet. I have some ideas. And this allows me to look for trends, patterns, changes of message over time. And so you'll see at the bottom here, we've got a folder here called Supercuts. And so we've got closed schools. 22nd of February was a key date at one point, hotels. We did something important down is the government's sort of secret scientific office, second dose. And these all reflect episodes that we've done where we thought, I remember probably the first case I did this with was an episode about the risk of mutants, escape mutants, and variants of the virus. The idea that, and we were exploring the idea that by actually vaccinating the population, that creates pressure on the virus to mutate in ways that were not helpful. And so we could search every time that one of those words or phrases was used across a year of government press conferences, and then copy and paste all of those sentences together so that I could grab particular moments and use them in montages.
That's great. Do you find yourself going back to this material over time? Is it something that you kind of revisit regularly and use for upcoming episodes?
Yeah, I did think about that when I started building it, thinking, is this worth the amount of time to put all of these things into here? But yes, we've used it across, I think, at least 5 or 6 different episodes at this point. And we just did a mini-series a few weeks ago looking back at the government's handling. We did that across 3 parts, their handling of the virus. And that's really useful because sometimes things happen and you don't realise their significance until later.
Right.
And so you don't have that sense of recall of, oh, of course, I remember. So in this case, what we found a story in here, which is on the 26th of November, they do these questions from the public that are sort of randomly selected. And there's a chap, Richard from Lancaster, asks, will the new vaccines work when the virus mutates? Or will new vaccines need to be developed? Now, that was the first time, as far as we can tell, that the scientific officers or people in government were asked that question. But it's not something that would come to mind. And so we actually opened an episode with that moment because we were able to find it.
That's great. That's great. Could you tell us about some of the tools that you use to sort of make this thing possible? How do you capture this? Excuse me. How do you capture this content, and how do you bring it into Descript, especially when it's live, when it's happening, when it's on a deadline?
So if it's live, we use audio hijack. So let me see if I can share that one instead.
Sure.
Let's have a look. I'll just stop and then reshare. Here we go. So audio hijack is amazing, and it can do all sorts of things. I think you may have used it as well, but
yeah.
What we do in this case is, for those 4 streams, I'll set up, so you may run NBC in Safari, CBS in Firefox, Fox News in Chrome, and then I have a little radio streaming app to stream our Times Radio feed. And then I set that in Audio Hijack to, I don't think you can see this on the screen, but basically you can set recording intervals. So I set it to start a new file every 15 minutes.
Okay.
And then that file, this is a bit elaborate but that file ends up in Dropbox.
Okay.
And then there's a service called Zapier, which you can use it's sort of like internet plumbing. So you tell it, when a file shows up in this folder in Dropbox, add it to a particular project. And then the result of it is that in our Descript project, so we had, on that US election night example, we had a separate Descript project that was just called Feeds. And down the left-hand side, every 15 minutes, you would see a new composition show up. And, it would be titled something like, the date and the time, CNN. So you could see, okay, this is the file that started recording on November the whatever at 9:06 p.m. And then those start to show up down the left-hand side. So if you know when something happened, and this is something that we do on these kind of overnight live sort of episodes, is we just keep a Google Doc of key moments. Okay. So it may be, there's a moment when, well, with the inauguration, we did this. So, it was this time when President Trump made these remarks to the press on his way to the helicopter. It was this time when that happened. But we're also, which would be easy enough to find afterwards, but we sometimes keep track of little things, like there was a moment in the weather forecast where the weather forecaster said, well, it's a stormy day for America and it's a stormy day for American democracy. And, that sort of thing that we could...
That's a one-liner, yeah.
Yeah, and we thought, we'll come back to that. And it would be impossible to go back and find that, really, unless you knew, I know that happened at that particular time. And even if I didn't, I can search for storms, weather.
Right.
That kind of thing.
So what we're looking at here, this is kind of your collection of news sources, correct? This is where you sort of get your audio from?
Yeah.
And then, okay. And then Audio Hijack is a tool that allows you to record audio from any source, no matter if you can actually record it, basically. Is that correct?
So anything you can hear on your Mac, you can record. Basically with Audio Hijack. Another thing I sometimes use as a source is a website built by one of my Times colleagues, and it's called VidGrid. And VidGrid is just a 2x2 grid, and you can choose different news sources. So you can have one of those terrifying screens where you've got all the kind of news networks up and see what they're talking about. So occasionally I'll use that as a source as well.
Yeah. Okay. Where did you get the idea to start using Descript in this way? Was it kind of a gradual process, or was there an aha moment when you realized that it could work this way?
So I think the first time was when I was working on a profile of the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. And she also, the Scottish government has a degree of, it can kind of run itself in some respects. And so they do their press conferences too. And I thought, because it was a profile piece, I wanted to have a sense of how the past 6 months had gone. And Scotland had just reached its threshold of 0 deaths per day. So I wanted that sense of hearing her say every day, and today, once again, we've had 0 deaths. And so I just grabbed, from YouTube, I think the audio of 5 or 6 press conferences, and there are various sort of Chrome plugins to download things from YouTube, and put them into Descript. And, that was really just to make it easy so I could search for the word 0. And then after a while I thought, well, what if I did things the other way around? Instead of knowing what I was looking for, what if I was just approaching this with ideas? Are there patterns that I might spot? So that was probably the first time. And I think we're still relatively early in doing this sort of thing.
Here we've got a question from Julia about a more granular step-by-step of how exactly this process works. Would love to see that. Maybe we could...
Sure. Yeah, we could look at an example.
Yeah.
Let's see. The only thing is I'm running this, as you know, Chris, on an older computer that I don't normally use. And so we can try live and see whether it's speedy enough to screen share and try and search all of this. So what I will often do is... Oh, come on. So let's say we want to find every time that the word mutant.
And James, just to interrupt, what we're looking at right now is essentially the archive project that you've built of all these news transmissions that you've brought into Descript, correct?
Yes, sorry. So this is, I should have said that. So this is all of the government press conferences that we ripped off the government website and dumped into Descript. And we labeled them. Really important thing for us was to put speaker labels. So it's too time consuming to label every time a different person speaks, but we would label them as you'll see here, kind of brief 26th of November 2020, that kind of thing. So I go into search in project rather than search composition, and then that will grind away and search the entire project for any mentions of that word. We may find out that this is beyond my 2013 MacBook's ability to do this. Normally I'm on a different machine. But once it does appear, you then see down the left-hand side in Descript, you'll see all the mentions of that word. You can go through and listen to them if you want to. But there's also a function that appears at the bottom that says copy. And you've got 2 options with copy. You can copy just the word. And occasionally you might want to do that. But more useful is copy surrounding sentence. And when we found that was the point where we thought, we could do something amazing with this. I think that was added probably 6 months ago or something.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So that then we could find not just kind of... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just curious, how has that copy surrounding sentence feature kind of changed this workflow for you?
Well, that's what makes it possible, really. I guess otherwise we would probably have to search for the word, find the mentions of the word, and then manually kind of select the surrounding sentence. Or we would just grab all the individual mentions and then have to kind of expand them out ourselves.
Right.
But this just creates these sort of instant, almost montages of, normally it's a single, here we go. So you can see, oh dear, it had it for a moment. Here we go. Right, so mutant is not a common word in government press conferences in even in COVID times. So you can see
Right.
there we are. It was mentioned on the 21st of December 2020. It comes up again on the 5th of January 2021.
Risk of an escape mutant. And that is a real worry, but quite a small real worry within the system. And I think we discussed this mutant. And that is a real worry,
clicked on something
but
to make this
mutant.
play.
And that is a
I don't know
type
if
of
I can
escape
turn this
mutant.
off.
And that is
That's a bit
a
weird.
real worry, but quite a small
Let's
real
see.
worry within the system. And I think
Okay,
Oh.
there we go.
There we go.
Yeah, so that's you can find all the mentions of it. And as I was saying, at the bottom, you go to copy, and then it's surrounding sentence. That's the
Copy
thing.
surrounding sentence. There you
Yeah.
go. So then you could actually grab all of those sentences, put them into a new composition, and then you have all these kind of tidbits of context speaking about the mutant virus or whatever it is that you wanted to search for.
Exactly. So, and then we put them in something called the supercuts folder. So you'll see if this appears. Yeah. So you'll see these are slightly longer sentences here, but we'll.
Okay.
This is kind of our starting point, and this probably gives us 4 minutes of stuff that we could work from, and then pack that down into something that was more like a montage. And so that's I regard that as a journalistic tool, basically, to be able to find all those mentions. But
Yeah.
you know, you can use it in a way that's just more fun and more illustrative, and so you can search every time. They need to buy them a clicker, but they have to ask for the slide to be changed when they do these presentations. And so you can find every time that they've said, "Can I have the next slide, please?" or "You're on mute." You need to
Yeah.
unmute yourself.
That's a very contemporary way to use this feature.
Yeah.
So is using Descript in this way to search and organize information like this, is it changing the way that you produce podcasts? Is it changing the direction or how you kind of ideate on the podcasts?
It's certainly making me think what would be possible that wouldn't have been before, and are there whole episodes we could do using this sort of technology? So you know, everything I've described really has been about, for the most part, kind of bringing life to stories that we were doing anyway.
Right.
I mean, that particular moment of when they started talking about certain things, you know, it changes your approach to it, but these are stories we would have done anyway. But more recently, I've been thinking, well, what could you do that would have been just impossible until recently? And so, you know, that episode I talked about earlier, this mission that NASA is launching, well, they tend to live stream an awful lot of stuff. NASA and SpaceX is running the rocket. And so I've started to think, well, for something like a space mission, could you take all these hours and hours and hours of recordings and find these little moments in it? So could you tell the story of a mission that might take, you know, in their case, it might take a few months. Could you pack that down for listeners? Could you start to search for particular phrases? There is an episode that we did on GameStop, the GameStop story, which we could talk about, where that did change the way that we approached that story in the end.
How so? What was the difference there?
Well, so the story for people who are not familiar is this group on Reddit called Wall Street Bets. They decide that they are all going to buy this gaming store that's a brick and mortar store, not in great shape. They're going to buy stock in that store, drive the stock price up, and they want to teach a lesson to the professionals on Wall Street. And so they do that, the stock goes through the roof, but then it crashes again. And that's happened a few times since. But we came to the story not immediately when it happened, but a little bit afterwards. So what we couldn't do was the kind of thing that other people had done the previous week, which was, who are these people? Who are Wall Street Bets? What is GameStop? Why are they buying it? I mean, you have to do that as a bit of setup. But the thing that we ended up doing that was different was realizing that this group of people, they were live streaming their chats on Discord, this sort of chat server. And all of that was being archived on YouTube. And so you could go and find these YouTube videos that were 12 hours each, but day after day after day of this group chatting. And if you cross-referenced their chats against, you know, if you knew when they were talking on which day, you could go and look at the stock price.
Wow.
So, so the idea was I have never heard firsthand what it sounds like for a group of people to lose a huge amount of money as it happens, and to watch their money evaporate. And
Wow.
that's what happened to this group of people.
Yeah.
We know that this sort of thing, of course, it happens among professional traders. Whether it's in Wall Street or the London Stock Exchange, but we're not there. We don't get to see it. And these people are not professionals for the most part. These are very often young people. Sometimes they're teenagers. Sometimes they're children, and they're probably. I mean, the portrait that we were often given of them is they're kind of bored in lockdown and looking for something to do, and this is what they decided to do. And so we grabbed the audio for a particular day. We couldn't do it for the whole week, but we decided, there's this day when the stock loses 40% of its value in about 4 hours. What does it sound like for them? And so we combed through it. And so there were particular times of day that we wanted to grab. But once we got those, and then we could also drop in this is what CNBC is saying as this is happening.
Yep.
So we could find these moments of CNBC is saying, well, this stock is doomed. And then cut to them and they're saying, guys, we need the faith. This is going to the moon. Right. Don't worry. Don't sell your stock. Typical kind of pyramid scheme stuff, really. But then you could also search for particular phrases and keywords. Let me see if I can find this in a project.
So that's that's a great example of here's a great comment from David, actually. Copy surrounding sentence. Yeah, that is a really powerful feature that I think unlocks all these kind of really creative workflows that you should definitely use. But I was just saying that I think what you just mentioned about using Discord voice chat, that's an incredibly powerful way of adding narrative context, literally showing listeners what the people affected were feeling in real time. And that just wouldn't have been possible even a year, maybe even 6 months ago,
Well, it's just a sequence of events, isn't it? The fact that that they were talking about it on Discord anyway, that they were able to find each other on Reddit, that it was being live streamed on YouTube, and that we could then take it from YouTube and make it usable and transcribe it and be able to search it. We wouldn't have been able to do that probably 2 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And the searching was really important because we could not just look at particular times, but search for keywords. And if you get creative about the keywords, at first you're searching for I've lost money. You're searching for the words hundreds, thousands, millions. You're searching for the words Wall Street, and they had their own kind of lingo of diamond hands and going to the moon, and so you can find all those moments too. But then when you try to imagine what it would be like to be those people, that's the key. If you can imagine what it would be like to be them, you think, oh, I wonder if they're talking about like my dad, my mum, my sister, my brother.
Adding that really personal element.
Yeah, and so we found a kid who said, I don't know if this is true because they kind of play with each other, but he was saying, I just sold my mum's car to put all the money into GameStop.
Wow.
And so being able to find those moments there's no way that we would find that otherwise, I think.
Of course, yeah. We had a question from Julia just asking how do you find this material on YouTube? It sounds like a lot of these channels that maybe archive broadcasts get quickly taken down. Do you have a strategy for finding this on YouTube?
Some of it is just familiarity. So you get to know, the BBC will not archive live streams, but they'll put up often news reports, and other channels in the UK will do that. Occasionally you the ideal thing is a live stream of some sort. So, when there was a murder in London a few weeks ago, and there was a vigil for the person who was killed, at which the police then became quite. There was a confrontation between the police and the people who were there, and became a kind of big moment in the UK, and that was live streams as it happened, and so you could see this event transform from a peaceful vigil to one in which there was a standoff between the police and protesters, and so if you can find that, then you can bring listeners that sense of, you hear the mood shift and you can imagine what it would be like to be there.
Yep. Yep. Maybe in our last little section, we can go back into Descript and just chat through some of the kind of editing decisions that get made in terms of transforming this archive material into a daily podcast.
Sure. Let me share mine again. Let's see.
There we go.
Okay. So this is the episode I mentioned, the GameStop episode, and this is our completed edit. You'll see we've put our script there. This is so we will have the way that we work is that we edit our interviews. So it always starts with an interview, and before that, an awful lot of planning to try and figure out what's the structure of this story, who are our characters. Can you tell this over 3 acts? And what are the kind of key moments we want to hit on? And are there moments of audio that we know exist that we want to come back to? And so we'll kind of start with a Google Docs plan before we even do the interview, and we'll very often talk to the person that we're interviewing beforehand in a pre-interview to find these moments. Because occasionally you read the print story and then you talk to the person and you realize, oh, there's this whole other story about how they came across it, or a personal connection sometimes, or an extraordinary moment that they just couldn't fit into the paper. So we'll do that beforehand. So then we record the interview, and you can see we've organized this in terms of this is our main edit at the top. This is version 4, and then interviews, actuality, as I was saying, and then the Wall Street Bets Discord. And so we'll edit the interview down, always with a view to having what we call a bait scene. So we always want there to be a scene that drags you in, makes you want to come and listen to the rest of the episode.
How do you find those?
Well, you try and figure it out before you interview the person. So you try and think, often starting in the middle of a story is a good place to begin. So, is there a really compelling moment in the middle of this that you can talk to me about? And then once I'm interested, I can say, but wait, where does this really start? And
right.
So you'll often hear podcasts it's called an E-shaped story structure. If you imagine a letter E, I don't know if I've done that the right way around.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're starting here, and then you're going back, and you come back to and then you want to propel it onwards a bit and give something new. So we'll edit the interview, and then we're starting to think about how do we introduce this to our audience. Usually it's with script, and you can see this is Sky News, CNN. So this episode starts. It started with a few posts in an online chat room. Within weeks, it was a global movement shaking the stock market. And so we've got Sky News saying, anyone on Wall Street who really knows what Wall Street is like, they can't believe this is possible. And so that's how we'll introduce it. And so, we do a combination of kind of, we sometimes are recording the script into Descript, but with the deadlines that we're on, often we actually export out to Reaper for mixing, for the kind of fine mixing.
Okay.
But we do all of our editing in Descript itself. And you can see we make an awful lot of use of markers, and you'll see here,
what do you use those for?
Sometimes it's notes for the so you'll see here there's a note for the person who mixes it, for our sound designer. Music dramatic pause must bleep this even if we use other swears later, because someone has used a particularly strong word that could not be in there. So occasionally it's notes for our colleague who mixes it at the end, because they show up as markers in Reaper. Sometimes it's that it might have gone to mix, but there's still a clip we want to add in. So you'll see kind of new clip 1, new clip 2, because we're still searching for those. And so we're kind of using Descript as we go as the kind of, this is the record of what the intended edit of this is, even as it's being mixed. But we also use it, especially if we're doing really quick turnaround episodes. So we did an episode the other week with the head of the British military, And we wanted to publish that the day after we interviewed him because it was a kind of very live news story. So as soon as we got the interview, we split that between two producers to edit, to kind of split it in two and edit one half each.
Okay.
And in that case, we made a lot of use of markers so that we could both see, you could very quickly look at the other half, like, oh, did he talk about the same thing twice? And we've got some kind of duplication there. Or you could say, oh, actually, could we make that the first thing that we hear? So that it just gives you that sense of being able to see your tape and know what you're working with.
Yeah. I know that you work on longer term, larger projects, and you also juggle these short, quick turnaround episodes. What are the challenges that go into managing those at the same time? How do you handle that?
Well, it's often a kind of giving your listeners a bit of a balance. So, the way that I listen to daily news podcasts is it's not my only news source. It's sometimes the first thing I listen to in a given day. Very often, either before I worked on doing this sort of thing, I would check my phone, see if there are any, check that the sky hasn't fallen in. If there is something that I'm interested in, go and read about it. But otherwise, kind of get on with my day. And so if you're a listener, you want to be informed about what the big story is that day, but that doesn't happen 5 days a week.
Sure.
And so there are times when we want to move very quickly, which could be anything from a big political moment to, if there's a terrorist attack or something that's moving very quickly. We want to be able to move quickly too, so that we're your kind of companion that morning and we're saying, we're going to help you make sense of the world. But the title of the podcast is Stories of Our Times, and we try and make sure that's not just a pun on working for the Times and the Sunday Times, that we're also giving you a sense of, here are the big things that are happening. And very often, sometimes if you look back on any given time, the big story that was happening was not necessarily the thing that seemed important at the time.
Right.
Sometimes there are these things that are under the surface. And so we make an effort to do these longer term projects, which can be, we did a mini series. There was a crime story in London that really got into the heart of how young people end up being laundered into gangs and can find themselves. They're called county lines gangs here in the UK. The way that the sort of drug selling is organised, and can find themselves in the heart of that. Now, if on any given day the story you would have seen on the news was this boy has been shot and we don't know who did it, and then it might be, well, there's been some movement in the search for the culprit, or perhaps there ends up being a trial or something, but you don't always get that sense of this is a kind of deeper undercurrent in British society or in another country. And so we try and always make sure we're working on, in any given week you're hearing something that we just made, usually, and very often something that we made over the last week or two, or sometimes a longer term project. So you've got that variety. It's a bit like doing the light and shade. You can't also be kind of here. I think for a lot of people, the news can feel like, here's a list of all the worst things that happened today.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And you need to give a bit of variety.
Yeah. What? Here's a question from Kim. Are there any copyright concerns when using live streams of news reports, anything like that? How does that work?
Yeah, so you should make sure that you know what the copyright laws are in your territory and how they work. And I'm not a media lawyer, but we consult the media lawyers on these things. Here in the UK, the guidance tends to be that if you're doing something that's, if you're using a clip for the purposes of kind of illustration, and it's just to make your story sound nice, that probably has crossed the line, and you shouldn't be doing that. But if you're using it as part of kind of either news coverage, or if it's for kind of cultural commentary, but you really need to be doing the kind of cultural commentary for it to work sometimes.
Right.
The guidance that we've been given is, if you're doing this for the purpose of news gathering, and you attribute where your sources are, and you're not using huge reams of it, and you're not using the kind of substantial part of it. So, if there was an interview with President Biden that the BBC had, and they spoke to him for 15 minutes, if we used a 10-minute chunk of that would cross the line, and that would not be okay, because that's not
right.
our stuff. But
Right.
yeah, you should be familiar with what the rules are in your territory.
That's always good advice. Maybe one final question just to wrap the discussion. How do you know when your episodes are done? When do you feel like you can just hit publish, especially on the daily news episodes?
How do we know when it's done? Well, it has to be done.
Yes.
Sometimes
Yeah.
it's when you've run out of time. I mean, it's a good point because you could on any of these episodes you could spend a week on them
Right.
instead of a couple of days.
Right.
I think you know when it's done when. I mean, often it's like that famous phrase. I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one instead. It's very time consuming to get a really compact kind of 20-25 minute version of a story.
Yeah.
When your interview may have been 45 minutes. And so it takes a lot of time to compress it down. I tend to think it's done when the story you've got contains everything it needs and nothing more. Is a good test for an edit, because anything we do could be 45, it could be 90 minutes, and it could take us a month to make, and it's just not what we do.
Yeah.
I think if you leave the episode feeling like the story itself propelled itself along and had some pace to it, I feel like I've learned about that particular story, and maybe I've learned something bigger about the world or about myself in the end. It often needs, if you're doing something over that length of time, and our episodes are normally 25-30 minutes, you need to have given something a bit bigger to your listener than just here's a gripping story.
Yeah. Well, James, that's fantastic. I think we're going to wrap this up. I just want to take a couple minutes to share with our viewers. If you need additional help with Descript, make sure to visit our help center at help.descript.com. It looks just like this if you pull up that website and navigate to our help center. And if you need additional support, you can create a support ticket through the submit a request button in the upper right. That looks like this. And then you can explain your issue, and a member of our team will get right back to you. And also make sure to join our Discord community. We have an active and growing Discord community at discord.descript.com. You can join us there, chat with other Descript users, chat with us, and learn more about the software. And James, I think that does it. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. And thanks for explaining this remarkable workflow, Searchable News Firehose.
Thank you. It needs a better name, doesn't it? It was great to chat. Really good to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Have a great day, everyone.